It began with a closed-door meeting that wasn't supposed to attract attention. Yet when King Charles emerged looking unusually tense, and Princess Anne left without speaking to a single aide, palace insiders immediately sensed trouble. Within days, whispers spread through royal corridors that a dramatic decision had been made, one that would strip Queen Camilla's son of privileges he had quietly enjoyed for years. What no one realized was that Anne had been preparing this move in secret for months. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. At first, those inside royal circles dismissed the rumors as another round of palace speculation. The monarchy had weathered countless whispers before, and many assumed this would be no different. But something about this situation felt different. The atmosphere surrounding the palace had become unusually tense, and even experienced staff members reportedly noticed a level of secrecy rarely seen in recent years. Conversations stopped when certain officials entered rooms. Schedules were altered without explanation. Meetings appeared on calendars only to disappear hours later. The sense that something significant was unfolding behind closed doors became impossible to ignore. According to reports circulating among palace insiders, the turning point came during a highly confidential gathering involving King Charles, Princess Anne, and several senior royal advisors. Officially, nothing extraordinary had taken place. Unofficially, however, whispers suggested that sensitive concerns regarding royal access, privilege, and long-term institutional boundaries had finally reached a critical stage. At the center of those discussions was Tom Parker Bowles, Queen Camilla's son, whose connections to royal events and circles had attracted increasing scrutiny in recent months. As speculation intensified, staff members reportedly observed unusual administrative activity taking place throughout several royal offices. Security reviews were quietly initiated. Access records were allegedly examined. Certain procedural documents that had not been referenced in years suddenly became topics of discussion once again. While no public announcement emerged, the growing pattern of activity suggested that officials were preparing for something far larger than a routine review. What made the situation even more intriguing was Princess Anne's apparent involvement. Known for her unwavering dedication to duty and her fiercely protective attitude toward the institution of monarchy, Anne was said to be conducting a series of private consultations with trusted advisors. Unlike many royal controversies that erupt suddenly, this one appeared carefully planned. Every meeting, every consultation, and every review seemed connected to a larger objective that only a handful of people fully understood. Meanwhile, King Charles reportedly found himself facing increasing pressure. Documents and reports were allegedly placed before him, each presenting difficult questions about the future direction of the monarchy. As discussions continued, speculation grew that the issue extended far beyond one individual. Some insiders began suggesting that a broader restructuring of royal privileges and access rights was being considered. If true, the implications would reach far beyond the immediate controversy and potentially reshape relationships within the royal household itself. The deeper investigators looked, the clearer it became that this was not an isolated dispute. Hidden beneath the surface was a much older conflict, involving influence, loyalty, and competing visions for the future of the crown. And with every passing day, more pieces of that hidden struggle began to emerge, leading directly toward a confrontation that had been years in the making. But the decision that shocked the palace didn't appear overnight. It was rooted in a battle that had been quietly brewing behind the scenes for years. Long before the headlines erupted, concerns were already circulating among royal insiders. As Queen Camilla's position strengthened, so too did the visibility of individuals connected to her family. To some, it seemed harmless. To others, it looked like the beginning of a dangerous shift in the balance of royal influence. The rumors that had begun as faint whispers after the coronation slowly evolved into something far more serious. In the months that followed King Charles's historic ascension, attention naturally focused on the future of the monarchy and the people closest to the throne. Yet behind the celebrations, private discussions were reportedly taking place among senior figures who feared that the traditional boundaries separating the institution from extended family networks were becoming increasingly blurred. The concern was not centered on a single event or a single decision. Rather, it was the accumulation of small developments that gradually formed a larger and more troubling picture. As Queen Camilla settled into her role with growing confidence, individuals connected to her family appeared with greater frequency in royal-adjacent circles. Publicly, there was little controversy. Many argued that these appearances were entirely natural and reflected the reality of a blended, modern family. But within more traditional royal circles, the situation was viewed differently. Certain courtiers reportedly questioned whether long-established customs were being quietly stretched beyond their intended limits. To them, the issue was not personal, it was institutional. The monarchy had always operated according to carefully guarded distinctions, and some feared those distinctions were beginning to fade. The deeper these concerns spread, the more intense the internal conversations became. Senior advisors found themselves debating questions that rarely reached public attention. Who should have access to private royal functions? Where should the line be drawn between family relationships and official royal privilege? At what point did inclusion risk becoming influence? These questions carried enormous weight because they touched the very foundations of how the monarchy preserved its identity across generations. Every answer seemed to create even more uncertainty. Amid these growing tensions, one figure reportedly remained unusually attentive. Princess Anne, known throughout royal circles for her devotion to duty and her unwavering respect for tradition, was said to be watching developments with increasing concern. Unlike others who voiced opinions behind closed doors, Anne reportedly chose a different approach. Rather than reacting emotionally, she began quietly observing. She listened, she gathered perspectives, she examined patterns that many others overlooked. What appeared insignificant when viewed separately started to reveal a far more complex story when viewed together. Meanwhile, the gap between old royal expectations and new realities continued to widen. Supporters of modernization argued that the monarchy needed to evolve with changing times. Traditionalists countered that evolution should never come at the expense of institutional safeguards. As both sides defended their positions, tensions simmered beneath the surface. Publicly, unity remained intact. Privately, however, concerns continued to multiply. What had once been dismissed as harmless visibility was now being discussed as a potential challenge to long-established royal boundaries. The atmosphere grew increasingly uncertain as more questions emerged than answers. Advisors whispered about future consequences. Courtiers debated possible outcomes. Yet while many remained focused on the visible disagreements, they failed to notice something crucial unfolding in the background. Away from the speculation, away from the arguments, and away from the growing noise surrounding the palace, a quiet effort was already taking shape, one that would eventually bring hidden concerns into the open and set the stage for a dramatic reckoning that few could have predicted. Yet while others debated, Anne was already gathering information that would eventually change everything. Princess Anne rarely acts without preparation. Behind her calm public image is a reputation for methodical precision, and according to insiders, she had quietly launched an investigation that few even knew existed. What she uncovered would become the foundation of an extraordinary royal confrontation. While public attention remained fixed on growing speculation surrounding royal influence, Anne was reportedly pursuing a very different strategy. She was not interested in rumors, assumptions, or emotional reactions. Instead, she wanted facts. The concerns that had been quietly circulating through royal circles had reached a point where simple conversations were no longer enough. Questions were multiplying, uncertainty was spreading, and the deeper the issue became, the more determined Anne reportedly grew to understand exactly what was happening beneath the surface. What followed was not a dramatic public challenge, but a calculated effort to gather information piece by piece until a clearer picture emerged. According to insiders, One of the first steps involved reviewing years of records connected to royal events, invitations, and access arrangements. Individually, none of the details appeared alarming. A name on a guest list here, an invitation there, an appearance at a function, access to an area normally reserved for a limited circle. But when these individual pieces were examined together, some advisors reportedly began noticing patterns that raised difficult questions. Were long-standing boundaries gradually being relaxed? Had informal privileges evolved into something more substantial? And if so, who had authorized those changes? As these questions intensified, Anne's circle of trusted advisors allegedly expanded its review. Reports were compiled, timelines were created, meetings were held behind closed doors. The process remained highly confidential because those involved understood the sensitivity of what they were examining. This was not simply about one individual or one family connection. It touched on the broader issue of how the monarchy protected its institutional identity while navigating modern relationships and expectations. Every new document seemed to reveal another layer of complexity. The deeper the review went, the more attention it attracted among senior officials. Individuals who had initially viewed the matter as routine reportedly began taking a closer interest. Discussions moved beyond administrative concerns and into questions of principle. Some argued that informal access was a natural consequence of changing times. Others believed that even small deviations from tradition could eventually create larger institutional problems. The divide was growing, and with it came a sense that an important decision was approaching. Meanwhile, Anne remained focused on the larger objective. According to palace insiders, she was not interested in assigning blame or creating unnecessary conflict. Her concern was the preservation of boundaries that generations of royals had carefully maintained. Yet, the information being gathered increasingly suggested that difficult conversations could no longer be avoided. What had started as quiet observation had evolved into a detailed investigation, and the findings were becoming impossible to dismiss. Eventually, the moment arrived when the collected reports, records, and recommendations could no longer remain confined to private discussions. Senior figures reportedly agreed that the matter required direct attention from the highest level. The evidence, accumulated over months of careful review, was prepared for presentation. And when those findings were finally placed before King Charles, they carried with them far more than administrative concerns. They carried the weight of a growing conflict between loyalty, duty, tradition, and the future direction of the monarchy itself. And once the findings reached the king's desk, the pressure to act became impossible to ignore. For King Charles, the situation was deeply personal. On one side stood his wife and her family. On the other stood the institution he had spent his life preparing to protect. The choice before him wasn't simply political, it was profoundly emotional. By the time the findings from Princess Anne's investigation reached his desk, King Charles reportedly understood that this was no longer a matter that could be quietly postponed. The documents, reviews, recommendations placed before him represented months of careful examination. More importantly, they forced him to confront a dilemma that touched every aspect of his role as monarch. Throughout his life, Charles had been taught that the crown must always come first. Yet now, the issue standing before him involved people connected to the woman who had stood beside him through some of the most difficult chapters of his personal journey. Duty and loyalty were suddenly pulling him in opposite directions. According to insiders, the king spent considerable time weighing the consequences of every possible decision. Some advisors warned that failing to address the concerns raised by Anne could create the appearance that royal standards were being applied unevenly. Others cautioned that taking decisive action could trigger tension within the family and attract unwanted public scrutiny. Every option seemed to carry risks. Every path forward appeared capable of creating new problems. The pressure was immense because the decision would not only affect individuals. It would send a message about how the monarchy intended to govern itself in the years ahead. As these discussions continued, the atmosphere within senior royal circles reportedly became increasingly intense. Meetings stretched longer. Opinions grew stronger. What had once been a quiet administrative review evolved into a larger debate about the future identity of the institution itself. Some believed flexibility was necessary in a changing world. Others argued that flexibility without limits inevitably weakened tradition. At the center of those debates sat King Charles, listening to competing perspectives, while knowing that the final responsibility would ultimately rest with him alone. Princess Anne, however, was reportedly unwavering. Having spent months examining the issue, she believed that hesitation would only allow uncertainty to grow. Those close to the process suggested that she consistently emphasized the importance of maintaining clear boundaries and preserving public confidence in royal protocols. Her position was not driven by personal feelings, but by a conviction that institutional rules existed for a reason. If exceptions became routine, she reportedly warned, the monarchy could find itself facing even greater challenges in the future. At the same time, historical precedents were carefully reviewed. Advisors examined how previous monarchs had responded when questions of access, influence, and privilege threatened to blur the distinction between family connections and official royal standing. The lessons from those earlier periods were sobering. Again and again, history appeared to show that uncertainty often created more problems than decisive leadership. These examples added further weight to the recommendations already building on the king's desk. As days passed, the emotional burden reportedly became impossible to ignore. Charles was not merely reviewing reports. He was confronting a choice that could reshape relationships, alter perceptions, and define a crucial chapter of his reign. The recommendations before him were now complete. Advisors had delivered their conclusions. Anne had made her position clear. The evidence had been assembled. The arguments had been heard. All that remained was for the king to decide whether loyalty to family would outweigh responsibility to the crown, or whether duty would once again demand a painful sacrifice. Then came the moment that would send shockwaves through every corner of the royal household. Without fanfare, without a public announcement, the order was reportedly signed. Yet the effects were immediate. Doors that once opened automatically suddenly remained closed, and privileges once taken for granted vanished almost overnight. For weeks, speculation had surrounded the king's decision. Advisors had debated. Princess Anne had pressed her case. Reports had been reviewed, arguments examined, and warnings carefully considered. Then, quietly and without the public spectacle many expected, the process reached its conclusion. According to palace insiders, a directive was approved that fundamentally altered the situation at the center of the controversy. There was no dramatic announcement from a palace balcony, no official statement explaining every detail. Yet inside royal circles, the impact was impossible to miss. The decision had finally been made, and its consequences began unfolding almost immediately. Those closest to the institution reportedly noticed changes before the wider public had any idea what was happening. Security procedures were revised. Access permissions were reviewed. Administrative systems were updated to reflect new instructions. Individuals responsible for coordinating royal events allegedly received fresh guidance regarding attendance, clearances, and future protocols. What had once been considered routine suddenly required additional scrutiny. The shift was subtle to outsiders, but unmistakable to those operating within the royal structure. As word quietly spread through palace corridors, disbelief quickly followed. Many insiders had expected discussions to continue for weeks, perhaps even months. Instead, implementation reportedly moved with remarkable speed. The recommendations that had accumulated through Anne's investigation were no longer theoretical possibilities. They had become active policy. For some officials, the pace itself was surprising. For others, it was evidence that senior figures had already concluded that delay would only deepen uncertainty. The most significant development involved the privileges that had long fueled debate behind closed doors. According to reports, access arrangements connected to royal functions and protected spaces were formally reassessed, resulting in restrictions that few had anticipated would arrive so suddenly. Invitations that might once have been considered automatic reportedly faced renewed examination. Existing clearances were reviewed under stricter standards. New procedures were introduced to reinforce distinctions that some believed had become increasingly blurred. The message, whether intentional or not, appeared unmistakable. Long-standing assumptions could no longer be taken for granted. Meanwhile, staff members found themselves adapting to an entirely new reality. Instructions were delivered. Expectations were clarified. Questions that had lingered for months suddenly had answers. Yet those answers created fresh uncertainty of their own. The implementation may have been swift, but the emotional and political consequences were only beginning to emerge. Readjustment carried implications that extended beyond administration and protocol. Relationships were affected. Loyalties were tested. Conversations that had previously taken place in whispers became impossible to avoid. Outside palace walls, rumors began moving faster than ever. Media observers noticed unusual developments. Royal commentators started connecting scattered clues. The absence of official confirmation only intensified speculation. The more the palace remained silent, the louder the questions became. What exactly had changed? Why had it happened now? And perhaps most importantly, who had ultimately pushed the king towards such a decisive course of action? Each new theory added fuel to an already growing fire. Yet beneath the headlines and speculation, another reality was taking shape. The decision may have resolved one crisis, but it was simultaneously creating another. Because while advisors focused on implementation and officials worked to enforce the new protocols, attention began shifting toward a figure whose response could alter everything. The order had been signed. The restrictions were in place. The machinery of the monarchy had moved. But the human consequences of that decision were only beginning to unfold. But the real drama was only beginning because Camilla's reaction threatened to create an entirely new crisis. Those close to the situation describe a period of extraordinary tension. The decision struck at something far deeper than access. It challenged influence, status, and years of carefully built relationships within royal circles. In the immediate aftermath of the king's reported decision, an uneasy silence settled over the royal household. From the outside, very little appeared to change. Official engagements continued. Public appearances remained carefully controlled. Statements were limited. Yet behind closed doors, according to insiders, emotions were running dangerously high. What had begun as a review of protocols had evolved into something far more personal. The issue was no longer about administrative procedures or access permissions. It had become a confrontation over trust, influence, and competing visions for the future of the monarchy. Reports soon emerged of difficult conversations taking place among senior figures connected to the situation. Advisors allegedly found themselves answering increasingly urgent questions as the implications of the decision became clearer. For years, certain assumptions had quietly shaped relationships within royal circles. Those assumptions had now been disrupted. Individuals who once felt secure in their standing reportedly found themselves facing uncertainty, while others viewed the decision as a long-overdue reaffirmation of institutional boundaries. The contrast could not have been sharper. At the center of the storm stood Queen Camilla. According to palace sources, she sought explanations from those involved in the review process, determined to understand how events had progressed to such a dramatic outcome. The frustration reportedly stemmed not only from the decision itself, but from the realization that months of investigation and consultation had unfolded largely beyond public view. What many had assumed was routine palace administration had, in reality, become a carefully organized effort that ultimately reshaped the balance of influence inside royal circles. As tensions escalated, family members reportedly found themselves caught in an increasingly uncomfortable position. Some attempted to remain neutral. Others quietly aligned themselves with one side or the other. Relationships that had once seemed uncomplicated suddenly became far more delicate. Every conversation carried added weight. Every interaction was scrutinized. The emotional impact extended beyond the individuals directly involved and began affecting the wider network surrounding the royal household. Senior royals were said to be particularly concerned about preventing the situation from spiraling further. According to insiders, efforts were made to reduce tensions and encourage restraint. There was a growing awareness that prolonged conflict could damage not only personal relationships but also public confidence in the institution itself. Yet despite those efforts, the underlying disagreements remained unresolved. The deeper issue was not merely who had access to certain privileges. It was whether tradition or personal loyalty would ultimately guide the monarchy's future decisions. The contrast between public calm and private turmoil became increasingly striking. While official appearances projected stability, reports from inside royal circles suggested a very different reality. Frustration, disappointment, and uncertainty continued to spread. Those who supported the decision viewed it as a necessary correction. Those who opposed it saw it as an unnecessary escalation. As both perspectives hardened, divisions that had once remained hidden became more visible than ever before. With each passing day, it became clear that the controversy was exposing fractures that had existed beneath the surface for years. The debate was no longer confined to one decision or one family connection. It had evolved into a broader struggle over authority, influence, and the direction of the institution itself. And while many remained focused on the emotional fallout unfolding in real time, one crucial detail continued to escape their attention. Princess Anne had never viewed this decision as the final objective. For her, it was merely one step in a much larger plan that was still quietly moving forward. Yet even as emotions ran high, Anne had already prepared the next stage of her strategy. The move that shocked the palace was never a standalone decision. According to insiders, it was merely one piece of a much larger plan, an effort designed to reinforce the boundaries between the monarchy and those outside the direct royal line. As the immediate turmoil began to settle, a clearer picture of Princess Anne's strategy reportedly started to emerge. For months, much of the attention had focused on individual events, isolated decisions, and growing tensions inside royal circles. Yet those closest to the situation increasingly suggested that Anne had never been reacting to a single controversy. Instead, she had been pursuing a broader objective from the very beginning. What many interpreted as a response to recent developments was, according to insiders, part of a long-term effort to strengthen institutional safeguards that she believed were gradually being weakened over time. The more details that surfaced, the more apparent that strategy became. Anne's concern, sources claimed, was not directed at any one person. It was focused on preserving the distinction between the monarchy as an institution and the personal relationships that surrounded it. Throughout her life, she had witnessed periods of change, moments of crisis, and countless debates about modernization. Yet one principle reportedly remained constant in her thinking. The survival of the crown depended on maintaining clear boundaries. Once those boundaries became uncertain, confusion inevitably followed. This belief appears to have guided every step of her approach. The investigation, the consultations, the reviews, and the recommendations were not separate actions but interconnected parts of a larger effort. While critics viewed the process as overly strict, supporters argued that Anne was simply doing what she had always done, placing duty above popularity. In their eyes, the controversy was never about excluding individuals. It was about protecting the framework that allowed the institution to function without ambiguity. What made her position even stronger was the support she reportedly received from key allies within royal circles. According to palace insiders, several senior figures shared concerns about maintaining established protocols and ensuring that future generations inherited a monarchy built on clear principles rather than uncertain precedents. Their backing transformed what might have remained a personal concern into a broader institutional discussion. The debate was no longer centered on one decision. It had become a conversation about the future shape of the monarchy itself. Historical comparisons reportedly added further weight to Anne's argument. Advisors reviewing previous chapters of royal history found repeated examples where blurred lines between personal influence and official authority created complications that lasted for years. These examples reinforced the belief that preventative action was often less damaging than allowing uncertainty to grow unchecked. To Anne's supporters, history appeared to validate the very concerns she had been raising behind closed doors. As more insiders revealed fragments of what had occurred during the review process, the broader objective finally came into focus. The restrictions, revisions, and procedural changes were not the ultimate goal. They were instruments designed to achieve something larger. The real aim was to re-establish confidence in royal protocols, clarify expectations, and ensure that future questions about access and influence could be answered with consistency rather than confusion. In that context, the controversy looked very different. What had seemed like a dramatic confrontation was increasingly viewed as part of a deliberate effort to strengthen institutional foundations. By this stage, even many who disagreed with the methods began recognizing the scale of what had been attempted. Anne's strategy was no longer hidden. Its purpose had become visible, and its impact was already reshaping conversations throughout the royal household. The immediate conflict had revealed a much deeper struggle over identity, tradition, and authority. And as those debates continued, one thing became increasingly clear. The monarchy emerging from this controversy would not be exactly the same as the one that entered it. And as the dust began to settle, the monarchy found itself entering a completely new chapter. What started as a whispered conversation had evolved into one of the most significant royal power shifts in recent memory. The consequences reached far beyond a single individual, touching the very question of who belongs within the monarchy's inner circle and who does not. As the controversy gradually moved away from the headlines and into the history books of royal observers, the true significance of what had occurred became increasingly difficult to ignore. What began as a quiet review of access and privilege ultimately transformed into a defining moment for the institution itself. The discussions, investigations, disagreements, and decisions that unfolded behind palace walls had exposed a deeper reality. This was never solely about one person, one family connection, or one administrative change. It was about the monarchy confronting a challenge that sits at the heart of every royal generation: the balance between personal relationships and institutional responsibility. In the months that followed, the long-term impact on royal operations reportedly became more visible. Procedures that had once relied on assumptions were replaced by clearer standards. Access arrangements received greater scrutiny. Internal reviews became more structured. Those changes may not have attracted public attention in the same way as the original controversy, but they reflected a broader effort to reinforce accountability within the institution. The monarchy had been reminded that even small uncertainties could grow into major challenges if left unresolved. For many observers, the most striking outcome was the renewed emphasis on traditional royal boundaries. Throughout the crisis, supporters of Princess Anne argued that her objective had never been exclusion for its own sake. Instead, they believed she was working to preserve distinctions that had protected the monarchy for generations. Whether one agreed with her methods or not, the result was undeniable. The lines separating official royal responsibilities from personal associations appeared stronger and more clearly defined than they had been before the controversy began. At the same time, King Charles' position gradually became clearer. Throughout the conflict, he had been portrayed as a monarch caught between competing loyalties. Yet the final decisions that emerged from the process suggested that, when faced with a choice between personal discomfort and institutional duty, he ultimately chose the latter. It was not necessarily the easiest path. It may not even have been the path he preferred. But for many inside royal circles, it demonstrated that the responsibilities of the crown continued to outweigh the pressures of family politics. Meanwhile, Princess Anne's influence reached new heights. Long respected for her discipline and unwavering dedication, she emerged from the episode with a reputation strengthened rather than diminished. To supporters, she had demonstrated the value of patience, preparation, and commitment to principle. What seemed at first like a solitary effort had evolved into a broader institutional shift one that reinforced her standing as one of the monarchy's most trusted guardians. The future implications for Camilla's family remained the subject of ongoing discussion. While the immediate controversy eventually cooled, questions about influence, access, and royal boundaries continued to shape conversations behind the scenes. Yet perhaps the most important legacy of the entire episode was the message it sent about accountability. The monarchy that emerged from this period appeared more determined to clarify expectations, protect institutional standards, and ensure that future uncertainties would be addressed before they could become crises. In many ways, this story was never about victory or defeat. It was about the continuing struggle to preserve an ancient institution in a rapidly changing world. It was about difficult choices, competing loyalties, and the immense burden carried by those entrusted with protecting a legacy larger than themselves. And as one chapter closed and another began, the monarchy stepped forward carrying lessons that would shape its future for years to come. Because in the world of royalty, access is never just about opening doors, it is about power, legacy, and who ultimately controls the future of the crown. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.